The views and opinions expressed on this show belong solely to the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of any outside institutions unless explicitly stated.
What's up, everyone? My name is Steve Vanderwall, and I'm the host of Cannabis Cum Laude, a podcast devoted entirely to cannabis. This podcast will cover a full spectrum of topics, including cultivation, business, medicine, politics, culture, advocacy, and everything in between. Because let's face it, the cannabis industry is very complicated. It's robust, and it has a ton of moving parts. So it's going to be my job to help you understand it a little bit better. So tune in every week for a brand new episode. And if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review the show. And if you really like the show and are interested in sponsoring, please shoot me an email at logistics@cannabiscumlaude.com. Now enjoy the show. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Cannabis Cum Laude. I'm your host, Steve Vanderwall, and I'm here today with Josh Neulinger, co-founder of JR Croptech. Josh, what's going on? Thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thanks for having me.
And a quick shout out to Ramsey for putting us in touch. I've been following you for a long time, and I've been so excited to talk to you, and I've been really interested in talking to you. And I mean this in a loving way. Like, nerding out with fellow cannabis people is like one of my favorite things in the world. And, you know, you're one of the kings. So I really appreciate your time.
That's the funnest part of the job.
Isn't that right? So I want to get an idea, you know, before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the interview, is talk to me about your background and how you got into the cannabis industry.
Okay. So I grew up in the Central Valley, born in Greeley, raised around Fresno area. So I was around ag my whole life. Went to Fresno State, did the whole thing there. But you know, when I was like 17, 18, I worked in a warehouse full of irrigation parts, and I was just like, how does this shit all work? Like, what are these valves that can like control the different, you know, you could like pump control valves, all these crazy big ag valves and whatnot. The plumbing on it just was kind of interesting because I was driving a forklift at the time, and anything else was more interesting. So I started kind of nerding out with the irrigation stuff. Wound up, they had a job opening for somebody in technical. Went over into, you know, kind of just helping with how to assemble basic systems for landscape, for, you know, small things at home, stuff like that for people. That was at NDS. They make like Agrifem rain drip. They were a different competitor of Netafim's. And then once I finished up college, I got a job offer at Netafim to go work there as account manager for some of their dealers. Went from that, Ramsey and I very well. He's the people person. I'm not. So I was pretty bored with that whole, you know, run around and just schmooze with people all day long kind of thing. So I got into the technical side at Netafim as well. Had a really great boss. Shout out to Zeb Barilka. He was he ran the company pretty much. The CEO was there, but he wasn't. Right. But in general, Zeb was he was the guy to go to at Netafim if you wanted anything done. He was the director of product management, marketing. I think he was the only one that spoke Hebrew on the team, so he could communicate with corporate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so. But I think it was like a year in or so after I started doing technical, you know, going out helping large farmers with big filter systems, fertigation systems, designing these 1,000-acre farms and whatnot for drip irrigation. I had always had an interest in a hobby in growing cannabis. I had grown plants in my garage since I was 18, and I'd always set up little systems just out of stuff I took from work, basically. And then so I was like, you know, why are we not in the cannabis industry? This was right around 2012 when Colorado went legal. I was like, we need to start like getting into cannabis. And Zeb was like, yeah, go ahead. So I went out and went to my first MJ BizCon and brought back a bunch of pictures and evidence of the size of it, which was what we needed to be able to convince corporate back in Israel that it was a worthwhile venture. After that, it was kind of just like, okay, let's do this. Let's see how far we can push it. And so that's where I brought in that little brown dripper that everybody uses. That was our way of tracking cannabis sales at first, and it was also it was because it was the best dripper flow rate for the application that was being used most often, the hydroponic substrates and whatnot. It took off, and we got that, and the the Netaflex system, the disc filters, the valve, the whole thing from their portfolio. Got it into the hands of some really influential growers like Jungle Boys. I mean, a lot of people went around and just they had sold maybe 2 of those Netaflex systems in the U.S. prior to starting working cannabis, and now they sell like 30 a month. So it's
wow, it
blew up pretty quick. But after that, so then the CEO of Netafim India didn't like what we were doing. They said it was making them look bad. So in their traditional agriculture markets, so we got kind of put on the sideline for a while, and I don't do well on the sideline. So at that point, I was like, I'm going to just get over into just working in the cannabis industry for real, where I don't have to, play these kind of games. And started working for Nameless in LA. That's where I brought Ramsey in. He was at Grodan at the time, and we used to do a lot of work together. I'm sure people have heard that whole background story on the First Smoke of the Day podcast 2 or episode 2. That would probably take another hour to talk about, but after that we left from Nameless, went up to NorCal up in Santa Rosa, worked there, got to fire up 2 brand new buildings up there, which was fun. Got to do the whole design build from start to finish and fire it up and operate it and see how it went. It was also one of the first buildings we had ever used LEDs with. They were still kind of a new thing. Not many people were using them at all. We threw them in the veg room just to kind of see what we could do. And that was where we got to cut our teeth on LEDs and have a whole lot of fun figuring out like the EC and all these things that change when you go into LED rooms. After that, we had brought Arroyo into NorCal. We were pretty much their only like large paying client at the time. They came to Ramsey and offered him a job as their main sales guy to build this Arroyo thing up. He left. And then I think 6 months later, he had gotten sales up to the point where they could bring me on too. I came in and did the kind of like grower support, helping consult for growers that were trying to implement the system. And then after that, we kind of we did that for a while, and we got to a point where we just realized like we could be doing our own thing and be doing a lot more of just the part that we want to do, which is the growing and the consulting and helping and nerding out on all this kind of stuff and creating our own products and stuff like that. And just it was the right move at the time, and so we founded JR Croptech, and then we've been doing that ever since.
Yeah,
that's kind of the overview of the background.
I mean, it's crazy because you essentially brought Netafim into the cannabis industry. I mean, I use all Netafim drippers. I use Arroyo, and I'll be honest, I didn't know that about you. And I hope people understand like how huge that is in just terms of like general industry growth. I mean, that's really impressive. I appreciate you sharing that with me. And now we
absolutely, yeah, we helped build the platform into what it is today. It was definitely a little different when we started with it. It was battery powered, like AA battery powered little loggers that you put in the room, and then you have to run all these wires over. So it's definitely gotten to be a much more impressive system nowadays. So they do a good job.
So now that you have now kind of transitioned into your own game, which is JR Croptech, which seems to have a couple different components to it. You have your consulting side, and you also have your fertilizer side, which is something I'm really interested in talking today about, plant nutrients and fertilizer and what goes into, really making not only a great fertilizer, but a fertilizer designed for cannabis. So when you guys were formulating your your formulation, what exactly is the thought process that goes into formulating something like this?
So typically, like for a new crop, it's a whole lot harder, right? Like if I was doing tomatoes or cucumbers, I could go look up the sufficiency research, right? There's research on pretty much every commercially produced crop on what levels of what nutrients are ideal at what times and for how long, and yada yada, the whole program from start to finish. Cannabis has none of that yet, right? Like there's some people doing some basic beginning parts of that, but I mean, just the amount of time it takes to get that done, some of us might still be alive by the time it's done.
Yeah, no kidding.
Maybe not. It's there's a lot to be done. So it's kind of it was definitely the Wild West. It was kind of figuring out through a lot of trial and error, right? We did tissue testing, of course, but what were the ideal levels in the tissue? Nobody knows, no, or at least nobody knew. We still can't say for sure because again, that research just hasn't been done, but we do know that when we saw the tissue levels that we like, we got the best results, right? So then it became, how do you get those tissue levels? But going way back to when it was before I even started at Netafim, my little garage grow at home, I had used some of the bottled nutrients for like my very first cycle. And after that, I was like, why? Like, I know what fertilizers are. I grew up in the Valley. I was around big ag a lot, and I had friends and family members who farmed. And when they would talk about those little bottled nutrient things, it was just all laughter, right? So it was, I was like, okay, well, everybody compares, at least back when I can't remember what year this was, but everybody compares cannabis to tomatoes, right? So let's just try a tomato feed, So I pulled up Peter's 51126, gave that a try in my backyard, and I was like, there's no reason to spend this kind of money on nutrients. Like, I kind of had that feeling, but you never know because of the way things are labeled. These companies don't always have to write everything that they put in the bottle. So it's like, who knows? Maybe they do have some kind of special boo-boo juice.
Yeah.
But no, they didn't. So it was, there's a recipe in the ag science literature called the Hoagland recipe, right? So it's like one of the original hydroponic fertilizer recipes that was developed to use on any plant for research purposes, right? So I said, okay, we'll start there. Let me take Peter's and adjust it how I can to make it as close as possible to the Hoagland recipe, and then let's run around of it. And then saw how that happened. It's a very vegetative plant, way too much nitrogen. But so I dialed that back. And it's like, okay, let's run this again, run it again. Eventually, I came up on a mixture of Peter's and like 5 other raw salts added to it that would make it pretty close to the formula that we use today. The micros weren't ideal, which is part of one of the reasons why I made the fertilizer, because it was like the Peters or Jacks or whatever people want to call it. It's a good fertilizer, but it's not made for cannabis, right? Like it's a veggie feed. So after we ran that Peters mix with the added MKP, MGS, calcium nitrate, calcium chloride, and the Peters all went into the formula, but we ran that for, years. We ran that Nameless. We ran it at NorCal, and pretty much everywhere else. We did anything for a while. And then, I had made this recipe, the Croptech recipe, based on all of these tissue analyses we have done over the years, and kind of just conglomerated all of my data and said, okay, now what have I learned? And what do I want to make here? And the part per million target ratios. I also worked with Perry Labs out in Watsonville. He does most of our tissue analysis for us, and water testing and soil testing and all that kind of good stuff. And his recommendations for like the NPK parts were pretty similar. So I was like, okay, well, we must be onto something here. And I went, formulated it from raw salts. We tried it at through a number of different cycles with different genetics, and we were like, yeah, this is it. So we went and found a manufacturer, and we had some struggles there in the beginning because there's a lot of not so good manufacturers out there, but we got ourselves in a good place. But in general, so the other part of the fertilizer formulation is in making sure that it's balanced and that you take pH into account, right? So there's different nutrient availability levels at different pH levels, right? So if you're designing a fertilizer to be applied at, say at like ours, like a 5.6 pH, that's going to have a different balancing than one that's designed to be applied at like a 6.5 or something like that, right? So taking that pH into account, and then taking in the milli equivalents, right? So most people talking ppms, nitrogen is, say at 2.7, ours is like 120 nitrogen, 150 P, 350 K, 180 calcium, and about 90 magnesium, right? Well, if you take basically the size of the molecule and its electrical charge into account, that's what's called the milli equivalent per liter, right? So your milli equivalent, if you then take and you look, those part per million values were nowhere near the same, but 180 calcium and 350 K is exactly the same milli equivalent. Right. So basically the plant is not force fed any one given thing. It is freely able to take whatever it wants, whenever it wants, without one thing interacting or affecting the uptake of the other. So that, and just a lot of trial and error, watching it work over, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions. Actually, yeah, I think we have over 1 million square feet of canopy that we're operating right now.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, different people, different clients.
But still, that's
we
huge.
run them. Yeah. So we're, and we were lucky to have a lot of people trust us to do that kind of thing, right? Like, they're just like, well, you know more about the fertilizer stuff than I do, so go ahead.
Well, it's,
having that trust and being able to run these things at such a scale was what let us come out with this as quick as we did. Otherwise, if it was just me in my garage, it'd probably still be another 10 years out.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, I mean, what you guys, what I've admired about you guys since I started following you is that you've always taken a data and science approach. We have this conversation a lot on the show. It's like a lot of the industry and a lot of the methods and stuff that we use and growers use and people use have been has been built on bro science. And there's some of them hold water for sure, but until we were able to actually have science-backed research and actually have real research in a control environment, which is something that you guys have really done a great job of. All of this, a lot of this stuff has been hearsay and, not really backed by real proof. So, I think what excites me, one of the things that excites me the most is really starting to see the new research that comes out and starting to hopefully put some fact behind or some fiction behind some of these things that we've all been brought up to use and implemented in our grows. And, I always go back to the conversation about flushing.
Well, there's definitely some, Yeah. 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 Well, there's definitely some that, there's this disconnect between academia and practice in reality, right? Like there's a lot of these people are way smarter than I am, right? That are professors at these universities and do a lot of this research. But then when you get out in the field, it's like, well, how do we apply this information, right? How do we actually set up a system that can do the things that we need to do to be able to get this result in the plant, right? We worked with, when we were working with Meter Group, which is was the parent company of Arroya. They were founded by Galen Campbell, who's a soil physicist from Washington State, right? Guy knows way more than I ever will about soil science and that kind of stuff, right? But at the same time, when we're talking about it, I'm like, okay, so when we hold plants at this like matrix potential, we get this response, so we can just do this in the field with the drip tape. When we use this flow rate, we use this. He was like, I didn't think that was possible. How would you do that? And like, so there's these, there's a big disconnect between practice and in actual real world and academia to begin with. And then when you bring in all of this bro science stuff, right? The stuff that we learned just growing in the garage and on forums and whatnot, some of it has validity, and some of it that where academia and people from ag are like, no fucking way. Like, there's no way that's true. You're just dumb. Some of it is, right? Like It was okay. So, for example, one study that Bruce Bugby is doing out at Utah State, right? He did a trial on phosphorus level, and if you know Bugby, a lot of his research has shown that most plants don't need the levels of phosphorus that a lot of farmers throw out there, right? Well, with cannabis, he thought the same thing, right? Like, why would this plant be any different? Why does it need any different? And he ran his trials at a 1.5 EC in his deep water culture and found the same thing. No, we didn't need a lot of phosphorus, right? Well, then we came along and said, well, but you're at 1.5 EC. Typically, in a real world growing scenario, you're not at. I mean, say we're talking about substrate now, because he would also do this peat moss substrate trial, but he'd use the same EC. And we're like, so if we were to feed 1.5 EC to a commercial grow, those plants would look terrible, right? So like that. So we had him run a much higher concentration trial. He went up to something like 8.0 even in deep water culture too.
Wow.
And he found that at a higher EC level, increased phosphorus did increase yield. So it's so some of these things that we've been saying forever that, people have this idea of they may not know why, and they may have a really weird attempt at explaining why it's happening, and that makes the academia and ag science people go you're fucking crazy. But there's a lot of times there's validity to it somewhere, right? Like that piece of information didn't just form out of a vacuum in someone's head. They saw something and that was their interpretation of it. So it's trying to figure out, what did they actually see that they interpreted it as this, and what can we learn from that to actually take that information and apply it in or along with ag science to get the real answer and what's actually going on and what the actual good practice is. It's fun stuff.
Yeah, because if you have hundreds of growers implementing a similar strategy under the same idea, there has to be some validity to it. I mean, there's some wild things that I've heard in my day, which I'm sure you've heard some crazy things about some people do. You've probably heard everyone in the sun, but when you start to hear the same things repeated over and over and over, it's like, okay, I think this holds some water. Now, how do we put it in a controlled setting to prove it? It's fascinating.
To prove it and figure out how far you needed to go with it, right? Like sometimes people go way too far with stuff. Just because you need more phosphorus than the low level doesn't mean you need 1,000 ppm
That's
of it,
right?
So there's levels to it. Figuring out exactly what were people saying, what did it actually mean, and how do we actually take advantage of that, whatever they did see, to get a better crop.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really all about optimization. I talk a lot about that on the show. It's find that perfect balance of efficiency and operations and revenue and whatever you're trying to accomplish. You can overdo anything. You can drink too much water. Everything in life is about balance. And generally, when you're in balance, you're optimal. And that is, I think that's a pretty good segue into something that I was really interested in talking about, and is obviously a big debate, not even a debate, just some popular commentary in the industry is the organic and soil versus salts, synthetics, and the argument of quality. I've heard people say best quality is in KNF, living soil, blah, blah. And I don't doubt you can probably grow some amazing absolute fire. And then I've had guys who grow in Rockwool with Athena who are also pumping out fire. And the question is there a difference? Is it, I'd love to get your perspective on that argument.
There is and there isn't. So in traditional agriculture, right, it's just a known fact that with organics, you are always going to get a lower yield than you will with synthetic, right? You always, just because of the finite energy that the plant has. When you grow using organics, the nutrient density in the soil is usually much lower than it would be with a salt-fed plant, right? So the plant has to grow a much larger root mass in order to get that nutrition. It's not chasing water; it's chasing the nutrients.
Yeah.
That was energy that could have gone to the canopy. So just right there alone, you're talking about a plant that used some energy in the root zone that it otherwise could have sent to the canopy. Not necessarily a bad thing. Now, it comes down to your sale price, right? Really, in the end, if you can charge more for organic cannabis, great. Otherwise, personally, I don't I don't really see much difference. I know a lot of people say that they can tell the difference between organic and synthetic and yada yada. I haven't personally gotten any organic flower that I was like, holy shit, this is like, okay, yeah, that's the way to go. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's all of how a plant was grown in a holistic fashion anyway. You know, your climate can have a huge impact on your quality. Your lights can have a huge impact on your irrigate. Everything can have a huge impact on your quality, not just the form of nutrients that are coming in. And even in that case, right, like, so when plants take up nutrients, it's through osmosis, right? So they are letting in one individual little ion at a time, right? They're not letting in a big chunk of like, you know, worm shit or something like that. So they have, like, say nitrogen, for example, plants can take up NO3 or NH4, nitrate, nitrogen, or ammoniacal form of nitrogen, right? They can't tell the difference between whether that came from calcium nitrate or worm poop, right? They have no idea, because it is the same exact ion. It's not a compound anymore. It's not a bunch of different ions glommed together that the plant's taking up. So you're not getting any of these other things coming into the plant. It's just that nitrate ion, one NO3. That's what comes into the plant. So, you know, I don't think that they're, you know, personally, I subscribe to the, you know, mineral density is mineral density. And if you can get it into the soil, however you do it great. You know, as long as if there's enough there, your plant's going to do well. Now, I haven't played around with much organics. I'm not an organic grower. I don't really know how to even mix up a soil like that very well. I mean, I can do it out in a big multi-acre field, but we're talking just, you know, throwing things down that like a corn farmer would throw down gypsum, and then running everything through drip. But still there, we're using, you know, urea, ammonium nitrate, potassium thiosulfate through the drip system. So it's I just, you know, knowing that the plants are taking up the nutrients in the same identical form, regardless of source, I can't imagine that the source alone has much impact on quality. I think it's a whole lot more of the other that impacts that.
Well, I think too, you know, with organics, you know, there's the nutrients, right? When you they're not bioavailable because they still have that carbon molecule attached, which has to be broken down, you know, through the microbes. So, you know, if you have a nitrogen burn or you have some sort of deficiency in your leaves and you need to adjust the nutrients with the salt-based, you can adjust it on the fly and you're going to see results, you know, ASAP, because that nitrogen is readily available. Where if you were to add a fish poop or a blood meal or whatever nitrogen source, it's going to have to go through a degradation process to remove that carbon group and make that, you know, which in some cases could be too late. So I personally, I think it's less about.
It's a much more complicated and like it's a lot more challenging, in my opinion, right? Like being able to figure out exactly what amendments to put into a soil to last an entire lifespan for that plant. Yeah, that's an art.
That's
right
an
there.
art.
You know,
that's for sure.
Hats off to the guys that do it.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's impressive that they're able to, you know, learn that plant well enough to know what it needs from start to finish and throw it all in the soil right away, instead of, you know, just being able to, like you said, adjust on the fly. You know, I think it takes some skill to do it. And, you know, and I'll never sit here and say that my way's better than anybody else's. Yeah. But as far as the, you know, the nutrient ions themselves, there is no difference between how, you know, the effect on the plant from getting that from, you know, some kind of organic source versus getting it from calcium nitrate or something like that. It's the same ion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the beautiful thing about this plant is it doesn't really matter how you grow it, you know, soil, hydro, whatever, you know, you can grow
a million ways.
There really is. Yep. That's the awesome thing. And I've always been personally interested. I started in soil outdoor.
Well, and that's what keeps some.
Yeah.
That's what will keep some variety in our market too, right?
Certainly.
Like if everybody starts doing the same exact thing, we're going to have a bunch of the same exact product out there.
That's
and that's
right.
no fun.
Yeah, that's no fun. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I think it's, some people are, you know, obviously try not to succumb to the sometimes silly debates on social media, but it's something that I see people going back and forth on. And, you know, I I'm interested.
People are passionate. They get
are.
almost religious about it sometimes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that religiosity, I try to keep away from that. Even my own dogma that I use in the grow everywhere.
Yeah.
I still try to say, like, I don't know everything.
Yeah.
I could be complete. 5 years from now, I'll probably be growing completely different than I am right now.
Yeah.
Because we keep learning all the time, and if you're doing that, then you're going to look back at yourself in 5-10 years and laugh. But that's part of the fun, part of the growth.
That's right. Growers are like chefs. I have an uncle who's a very successful restaurateur. He's been in business for like 25 years, and it's his way. There's no coming in really and saying, hey, maybe you should do this or you should change the menu. I've been doing it for 25 years. It's my way. Hey, here's some proof that it could be better. Don't care. This is my way. And I see a lot of growers who are like that, and hey, respect to them,
Whatever works for you.
I agree. I want to talk about something that has been a really popular topic in cultivation. Everybody really knows what crop steering is at this point, and a lot of people are now implementing it. One thing that I didn't realize was there's a lot of, I have a bunch of friends who've been growing a lot longer than I have been, generations even, who are just finding out about crop steering, which is really cool because it's like, guys who've been doing it forever, who knows what they can do to their product now with, this type of strategy. Oh, yeah. But we know what is, but the question is, why exactly does crop steering work?
Well, and even the what is usually misinterpreted, right? So people think that crop steering is something you can add to your practice. You're already steering your crop whether you know it or not. Everybody is, because it's all crop steering really means is you change something about what you're doing to the plant or its environment to get a response out of it. That's all that means. So it's, it kind of turned into this weird buzzword where it sounded like people were saying you could like add crop steering to your reservoir, but that's not, it's something everybody's doing, right? Whether they know it or not. It's figuring out, like, how do you do it intentionally? And how do you use the different tools that are at your disposal to affect those changes in the plant that you want and get a desirable result? But as far as the why, why it works or how it works, in hydroponic substrates, which is what most people that do crop steering are using, or do this method of crop steering through irrigation scheduling are using. Let's back up. So a natural soil, when it's at its absolute wettest, the matrix potential, which is basically a measure of the surface tension of the soil particles against the water, right? How much energy does it take to pull that water out of the soil? The matrix potential of a completely soaked soil is about 20 to 30 kilopascal, negative 20 to 30. It's a negative number, so it gets weird, fun to talk about, but they wilt at about 1500 kilopascal, but plants can start to notice, or cannabis plants, I should say, because every crop is different, but cannabis plants can start noticing the water reducing right around 80 kilopascal or so, 80, 100, something like that. And so that's when they enter kind of like a drought stress mode, right? And they will start conserving water because they see the water's going away. They start throttling down stomata, not transpiring as much. They slow down their metabolism, their growth rate, yada, 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 right? And they go into kind of a generative response. So it's get my reproduction done so I can get my genes out there before I die, right? Just the whole evolution thing. Yeah. Just or how plants they're solely focused on reproduction, right? So in hydroponic substrates, you can't use that water level, right? At the absolute wettest, like let's take rockwool, for example, the absolute wettest, you're at basically 0 kilopascal. And at the absolute driest that substrate can get before the plant dies, you're at about 4 kilopascal. So you can see the absolute driest rockwool is still easier for plants to absorb water from than a completely soaked natural soil in the field. So we can't really use that dryness level to give the plant that drought stress response, right? Which is what we use to get that, in the first 3 weeks of flower, we use that water stress, a light water stress signaling, you don't go too crazy because then you just shut them down. But a light water stress gives you a better stack, gives you more bud sites, it keeps the plant a little stockier. It has a lot of good benefits to it, to doing that in those first 3 weeks of flower, especially. But to be able to do that, we have to use osmotic potential, which is another piece of the total water potential that the plant feels, right? The amount of force it has to overcome to absorb water. So the osmotic potential is basically just due to dissolved salts. You're roughly about every 1.0 EC is about, with typical cannabis nutrients, or really any fertilizer, is about 38 or 40 kilopascal. So we use that EC to actually give the signal to the plant. So a lot of people really focus on the dryback percentage, and that's really the wrong part to focus on. So, say you were to start watering 2 hours after lights on, you get all your watering done within 2 hours, and you spend 22 hours drying down, or 20 hours drying down, and before irrigation starts the next day. And then, 22 hours drying down before irrigation starts the next day, but you only get a 10% reduction in water content, compared to scenario 2, where you only get, say you have to water way further into the day, and you stop, and you only get about, let's say 14 hours of dryback, but you got a 30% decrease in water content versus the 10 that you got with the other one that had 22. Option A, with the smaller percentage dryback, is still far more generative than option B because of the timing. So the amount of time that the plant spends drying back is more critical than the percentage it drops. Because again, the plant can't tell, cocoa is pretty much the same. It only goes up to like 40 kilopascal or so. The plant can't tell that the water's going away. Yep. They feel the same ease of uptake of water until that substrate's basically mostly gone. That was the point of hydroponic substrates, was to make it easy like that. Yep. Right? It's supposed to provide for better growth than a natural soil would. That was the original idea behind the substrates. So because we can't use that part, we have to use the EC. That time of dry down, during that dryback, you're also seeing the EC climb up slowly. So that is actually the important part that's signaling the plant. It's not the reduction in water content. It's over time, during the lighted hours, is that EC slowly going up. And if it is, you're getting a more generative response than you would if it's not, basically. So a lot of people focus on, okay, what dryback percentage should I get from lights off to lights on the next day? And really, that doesn't matter all that much. Right? Like, we have targets because we generally know what it does to the substrate. And that's how we taught people that method, because it's a whole lot easier to grasp on your first try, to just say, okay, aim for this percent dryback. If you have your lights roughly in the range of PPFD we use, and your climate's relatively similar, you're probably going to spend this much time getting or drying back to be able to hit that target. So we taught people the easy way, but it may have been I probably should have gone more into the detail for some up front, just so that they understood that the more important part is that EC and what it does throughout the day, what your high is, what your low is, where it's moving throughout the day, and that kind of stuff, because that osmotic potential is actually what signals the plant for us.
Well, it's also probably a little more difficult, to tell, what the EC, what the EC is in the substrate compared to what the dryback is, because at least without substrate sensors, you can, if you're seasoned, you can get an idea of what the bag weighs. You have no idea what's going on inside the substrate from an EC perspective. Yeah. So
you can take runoff values, but that will only get you close, and then it depends on how big is your substrate. What's your flow rate through the drippers? Yep. How far are they spaced apart? Are you hitting runoff before the media is completely saturated? Are you actually pushing down the old nutrients top to bottom and out? Because that's how you want to do it. You want to be dripping slow enough where it's pushing all of the old stuff out the bottom, but then that's what you're left reading, right? Is the old stuff that was not used by, a bunch of, even like the hydrogen and hydroxyl atoms the plant shit out in exchange for its nutrients. So, reading even pH from the runoff is kind of hard to really rely on, because it's the waste, Yeah. So that's interesting. It is definitely tough if you don't have substrate sensors to do this kind of precision irrigation steering kind of stuff. you can still do it with a scale and a syringe, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah. And when we're talking about optimization, you definitely want to have substrate sensors. I mean, I went for the longest time.
Yeah, you're going to spend so much labor doing it manually.
Yeah.
It's just not going to be worth it.
Yeah. I want to talk about something that is relevant right now, both to me and to a lot of growers in New York who are preparing for licensure and are starting to grow out of their basements or small warehouses, and we're going to start seeing some more at-scale operations, which means much more sophisticated room design and capacity loads and all that stuff. Energy is obviously a big thing, and I'll be, very transparent. When I really designed my last room, I didn't really fully understand the math, and when it all came down to it, I went way under in dehumidification and air conditioning, right? And I had to bring in supplemental AC, and I was only ever it was a struggle for me, and I'd like to try to prevent that from people from happening because it's an expensive mistake, right? So when you are, when you are building out a room, what are in terms of, creating a room that has enough power, whether it's 10 lights or 50 lights and all these dehumidification, how do you determine total energy capacity before design, when you're designing out a facility to make sure that you have enough power, you have enough AC, you have enough dehumidification to handle everything that's going on in that room?
Usually we're working within the limits of the property, right? Like a lot of times it's, how much power do you have? Well, let's work with that.
Sure.
Because the getting upgrades can be a, year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year process, depending on where you live. Getting more power is doable for some people, but for a lot of them, it's very not doable.
Yeah.
So it's kind of more, let's take the property, see how much power you've got to work with. That will dictate the size of canopy we can do in here, because we don't want to spread everything out and do things like barely on the edge, or not, like you said, not have enough dehumidification, for example, or something like that in order to get a bigger canopy, because it's just going to go to mold, basically. Yeah. So, starting with what you have, don't push the boundary too much. You blow up the transformer, PG&E gets mad. They don't like that. But, and then as far as capacities go, that was a lot of just learning over the years what worked. There's calculations you can do, and if people really want to nerd out on it and get into it, just go with the psychrometric chart and maybe look up some videos on how to use it or something, and you can do a lot of that math just with that chart, right? And figuring out your not your loads from cannabis, but what is the HVAC equipment going to do? What are your entering and exiting conditions? That'll tell you how many tons of cooling you need, basically. But we've also come up with just rules of thumb now that we know all of this and are able to kind of just simplify all of that math, right? So typically, like for dehumidification, for example, what was this? Sorry, somebody's blowing up my phone all of a sudden. Calm down. Anyway, so for dehumidification load, there's a lot that went into figuring it out, but basically, like a rule of thumb for people is 6 pints per plant per day. If you put that into your facility, and when you're running these kind of like high output crop steering tactics that are getting these like 100 gram a square foot yields, and if you're under HPS, I think we hit like, was our biggest, I think it was like 4.8 per 1,000 watt light. Wow. Under some PL. But so when you get the plants to perform like that, they put out a lot more water, right? A lot of water into the atmosphere. But in general, if you have a room and you have your own practices and you don't have that kind of load going into it, you may be able to get away with less dehumidification. But basically, if you just account for however much water you irrigated into those plants, account that you need to bring that back out.
That's right.
So if the total volume of water you're putting into that room, give yourself the same in pints per day for dehumidification, at least. There is differences in timing, right? Like plants don't transpire much at night, but there's also no help from the ACs at night.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, there are a bunch of things to figure out to get like precise, but I found that if you give yourself 6 pints of plant a day and you're in one of these commercial buildings, you'll be okay.
You'll be okay. Yeah, that's
what we use for our design capacity metric.
Yeah, I've always just went for every pint I bring in, I pretty much calculated how much, based on my highest,
take it back out.
My largest, my highest irrigation is usually week 4 to week 6. So during that, what is the max amount of water that I'm giving the plants? And then I designed HVAC based around, that. So whatever pints you're bringing in, make sure you can take it out.
That is the easiest way to make sure. You may, some people may wind up oversized with that because some comes out and run off and goes down the drain,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Not all of that water actually gets transpired or evaporated out. Jeez, Ramsey, you knew I was doing this. Why are you calling me?
He's trying to three-way in.
I don't know what he's doing. Okay.
Yeah, something I ought to say.
Anyway. Yeah, I guess. But anyway, so the dehumidification load is definitely important. How you get there it doesn't really matter. Some people like to use reheat. Some people like to use other units. There's a big debate around that too. I know that, in some cases, reheat makes way more sense because you don't want to buy a dehu and you've already got the ACs. You throw, especially if you have the ability to do like hot gas reheat where it doesn't cost an arm and a leg in electricity to do. And those ACs, a 5-ton can do like 500 pints a day or something like that, I think, or 600. They can do quite a bit. But we do still use separate dehumidifiers for stability purposes, right? Because if you're running the dehumidification part, you can't be running the AC, you are running the AC, but you're not cooling at the same time. And so, to be able to have multiple stages, which is one of the important parts, right? Having multiple stages of cooling and multiple stages of dehumidification, so that, because the plants grow, they're not always the same output. So you can't just have your maximum running.
Yep.
Anytime you switch it on, you want to be able to just switch on one of them, or switch on 2 of them or any combination thereof. Staging is important. Having enough is important. But really, how you get there doesn't matter if you're using DQs or reheat. You're pretty much spending the same energy wise anyways, because the DHU just turns latent heat of condensation into sensible heat, which then the AC cools. So it kind of it does let each device do what it does best, right? Like, Quest and those kind of like little dehumidifiers, cool, but like something like dry air is more like if it was an ideal world and those would fit everywhere, that's all I'd use. We do use them in greenhouses, definitely, because you could not use something like Quest or Andon in a greenhouse. No. They'd just be way too many. At least to be able to keep it perfect underneath that blackout curtain at night. But the dry air units are very, very efficient at what they do. They don't blow out super heated air either. It's just kind of like neutral. But they move a lot of air. They move like 13,000 CFM or something like that.
Holy cow.
In each unit. It's but it does. It's a dehumidifier that was actually designed and built for the horticulture industry. It wasn't some repurposed commercial dehu, right? That was meant for warehouses or something like that. So these ones are actually rated at 60 degrees instead of 80, like most of the small dehus out there are, and they do something like 12 gallons an hour at 60 degrees, which is a crazy amount of water removal.
Yeah.
But
wow.
But anyway, tangent on dehus, but hopefully the capacity question was answered.
No, it's honestly something I'm really passionate about. I really enjoy room building, and I've keep learning from. I made a lot of mistakes in my first room and put a ton of money into it, and I see a lot of guys trying to make moves in the legal market and upgrade their game. And, it's a different animal going from your couch or your garage into a warehouse with, it's completely different. So I just want,
they're very, very different. Yeah. Very, very different.
You'd hate to see somebody, burn through their hard-earned investment capital, which we already know is an absolute fucking nightmare to deal with in this industry, and have to redo something or way go under on capacity. You know what I'm saying? So I appreciate you sharing that, because
that and humidifiers is another big one. I don't see enough humidifiers in people's flower rooms, especially. It's a lot of people have them in veg, but veg should never get below 65% humidity like ever. So you definitely need them there, and having them in flower. Same thing goes for your first 3 weeks of flower. If you're steering generatively in the root zone, those plants are sensitive to environmental stressors. So having that, or making sure that that VPD never gets above 1.4 becomes really critical when you're doing that generative crop steering. And a lot of times when people are putting plants into a flower room, the flower room's designed with, a lot of dehumidification, a lot of AC, and it just dries it out super quick because the plants are still small. Yeah. So those humidifiers in there are also another critical thing that we don't see enough of. That's one of the first things we usually do when we sign up a new client is we're adding dehus and humidifiers.
Yeah, a lot of people, are scared of humidity too, especially in flower and air. Small home grower buddies that I know are air on the side of dry, and it's...
You're going to give yourself more PM that way. Yeah. In the ag world, PM is known as dry mold.
Really?
So it needs that dryness in order for its spores to desiccate enough to become airborne and spread to the next site. So if you don't let it get that dry, they can never move, and you'll have one spore maybe that grew on your leaf, but you'll never see it. You'll never know it was there.
Wow.
Because it can't reproduce. So having, we've gone into so many facilities that have crazy PM problems, and they're running, 45-50% humidity. We raise it up to 70, no PM anymore at all.
Wow.
No extra IPM steps, no nothing. Just raising that humidity gets rid of the PM.
Completely
it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But give it a try.
Hell yeah. Fascinating. Yep. That's a pro tip right there. I hope everyone's paying attention to that.
Yep.
Well, dude, I really, really appreciate, with everything you got going on, giving me an hour of your time and chatting with. I really appreciate it. I love nerding out, especially to people like you who really are, have been at the forefront of this in more ways than one, and obviously have a ton of respect for you, and I know a lot of people do too.
Well, thank you.
On a personal note, if you had to grow your own garden for the top quality cannabis, what's your preferred method of cultivation in terms of substrate, light type, etc.?
Well, I'm starting to turn more towards LEDs. A year ago I would have been like HPS all day long, because it was just because we didn't know how to use them yet, right? And we didn't know the differences between spectrums. But we found a light with a very good spectrum that actually gives roughly the same or even shorter flowering time than HPS does. But high light intensity, that's the most critical. The spectrum does matter, but far less than the intensity does. Okay. PPFD is king. 1% light is 1% yield. Yeah. So if you're like, if I was to build an ideal grow, I'd probably be somewhere 1,500 micromoles of LED. Single layer, I don't really like racks because it's, we're talking about a volume of canopy, not just square footage. And so if you rack them up like that, you've got maybe 2 feet vertical feet of usable canopy on each rack in like a 4 foot or 5 foot tall rack. Yep. And you stack 2 on top of each other, that's 4 feet. I can get 5 feet of usable canopy from a single layer. Yep. So it's like, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that there are people that are doing multi-tiers that are trying newer methods with like smaller plants and whatnot, and that makes a lot more sense than trying to grow a 6 foot tall plant in a rack. Yeah. But anyway, so that I like cocoa, 1 gallon cocoa, like Dutch plantain is the one we use pretty much everywhere right now. That we use Rio Cocoa, some other versions, just depending on what's available, or as long as it's roughly within the same specs and parameters on like chip to pith ratio, stuff like that.
Sure.
Drip irrigation all day long, and of course JR Croptech fertilizer.
Absolutely.
And substrate sensors. I can't grow without them anymore, to be honest, man. I don't want to. It takes so much effort to get that data other ways that if I don't have that little sensor stuffed in the side of the bag and a graph I can go look at, I'm just not interested.
Yeah, and even like I haven't even upgraded to like the 24-hour monitoring. I'm still using my spot sensor, which is helpful. I couldn't imagine just having 9 weeks or 11 weeks full of data that I can like, oh wow, no, that's my next move. So I agree with you. I think once you get,
I'd recommend it. Yeah, it's nice to have. I mean, there's other options out there for for home growers that can't, because I know Arroyo can't even sell to home growers. There are other options out there. Some of them coming, some of them already out there. I think like that you can get like that HoboNet setup or the RNet or whatever it is that has basically has the Terrace 12 sensor and then just some other form of telemetry and a graph that you can get. So there's some other options out there, but yeah, it's hard. I would at least have to have the spot check.
Yeah.
Even with the spot check, you can get a graph going. It's just not going to have as many data points.
That's right.
As long as you take it at the right times, right? Like you take your reading right before irrigation starts for the day. Take it right when you hit runoff. Take it, halfway through the day, and then right before the lights go out.
Yep.
You've got a pretty good idea of what your pattern is through the day.
Yeah. I agree. Once you have access to the data, it's hard to go back.
Right. 100%.
Well, dude, thanks so much for your time. It was a real pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and really everything you've done to help move this industry forward. And I look forward to watching you and watching what you're up to next. And I'm sure our audience will have a lot of questions. Where can people find you online?
My Instagram is super unoriginal. It's just at Josh_Neulinger, which is Neulinger. Or my email, josh@jrcroptech.com.
Okay. And I'll put both of those in the show notes so people know how to get to you.
Right on.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, my man,
thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for coming on. I hope we can do it again soon.
Absolutely.
All right.
Love to.
All right. Well, take care. Everybody, this has been another episode of Cannabis Cum Laude. This is my guest today, Josh Neulinger, co-founder of JR Croptech. We'll see you next week. Thanks again. Thanks to our friends here at Rockbox Recording and Production in Rochester, New York. They are a full professional podcast and video studio designed by a radio guy for podcasters. Audio, video, voiceovers, editing, whatever. Mouth off at Rockbox at rockbox.com.
You can follow Cannabis Cum Laude on LinkedIn and all other social media platforms, as well as Cannabis. And if you'd like to help support the show, search up Cannabis Cum Laude on Patreon. And of course, all of those links are in the show notes. Thanks for watching and listening.